I want to welcome Dave Ferguson with me today. Say hello to everybody, Dave.
Hello, everybody. How you doing?
Hey, Dave. I know we're going to talk about your new book here in a moment, but in all the conversations we've had through the years, we've never had a chance to talk about your role with the New Thing Network. Could you just give a quick overview of what New Thing is all about?
Sure. Long story short, probably, 12 years ago or so, we had a youth pastor, a guy who I loved, came to me and said, "Hey, I want to do what you're going to do." And I said, "What?" Or what you did? And I said, "What did I do?" And he said, "Plant a church." And it's kind of embarrassing. We hadn't planted any churches up to that point. We've been around for, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 years. And kind of to put him off, because I wanted to be our youth pastor, I said, "Well, where are you thinking?" He said, "Denver." And I said, "Well, why don't you just go out there and check it out and then come back and we'll talk about it." And he went out there, came back after being gone a week, and he had raised more than $100,000 in less than a week.
Wow.
And he said, "Yeah, I think God's behind this." And I said, "Yeah, I think you're right." So what we did is we got him and his wife up in front of our whole church and said, "Hey, it's clear God's at work here. David and Heather are going to go plant this church. And I think some of you ought to go with him if God's in it." And we had about 35 families that moved from Chicago out to Denver to help plant that church. And we stayed in relationship, and that was the first church. And then fast forward to today, there's about over 1,500 churches that are now a part of New Thing and 177 networks. And the primary thing that we do is really just how do we help churches multiply and reproduce. And my role is really kind of just the visionary, kind of like, okay, where are we taking this thing next?
Well, that's great. And I have churches periodically that tell me, can multi-site churches be about church planting as well? And can church planting churches be about multi-site as well? And I always say, well, you need to go check out what the Ferguson brothers are doing in Chicagoland, because they're doing both very well. So thanks for sharing a little bit about that story. But
sure.
That aside, my primary reason for wanting to connect with you today is about your new book. It's called Hero Maker, and it's about multiplying leaders. And so tell me, first of all, why did you write the book?
A lot of it, of course, comes from my experience, but kind of the catalyst for it was through Exponential, the third hat. So I'm the pastor at Community Christian Church in Chicago. I also am the visionary for New Thing, but the third hat I wear is president of this conference called Exponential. We do a bunch of other stuff. But as we did research on churches in North America, we discovered that churches could basically fall into 5 different categories. You kind of got level 1 churches that are churches in decline, level 2 churches that are churches that are plateaued, and about 80% of all churches fall into those 2 categories. Level 3 are churches that are growing, and you got about 16% of all churches. Then you got these special 2 categories of what we call level 4 and level 5. Level 4 churches are churches that are reproducing. Whoever started a brand new site or a brand new church, and only about 4% of all churches across the United States have ever done that. And then you got this last category of multiplying churches, those that have kind of serial planners, movement-making churches. Maybe you got a handful at the most across the United States. So we started looking at all those churches, particularly those level 4, level 5 churches, and the leadership in those reproducing, multiplying churches. At the smallest level, small group leaders and missional community leaders, and also at the senior level. And we had to look at them and say, okay, so what are the practices in those reproducing and multiplying churches? And then we also kind of begin to pair it up against the Gospels and the life of Jesus, his leadership. And we had 2 different days where we brought together groups of people just to talk about it, some thought leaders on this. And we had a whole long list of here's the practices we see. And then we kind of pared it down to 5. We said, here's the top 5, what we call essential practices of these multiplying leaders. And that's kind of the core of the book. So if you want to be a leader that multiplies leaders, here's the things we learned from Jesus, but also from these really kind of premier level 4 and level 5 churches.
Yeah, and I don't know if you find this to be the case, Dave, in the conversations you're having, and certainly in the churches, particularly the ones that are connecting with you through the New Thing Network, is oftentimes as I'm talking with churches about this desire to be reproducing and multiplying, it's not a sense of we don't have opportunities or locations where we could go. And in many cases, the financial resources are actually there as well. The big hang up is the leadership. They don't have the leaders to go. do you sense that that's the case as you're connecting with other leaders too, that may be one of the key kind of barriers to
Oh,
actually
absolutely.
experiencing multiplication?
Absolutely. I think that's part of the reason that only 4% are reproducing or multiplying. And I guess maybe I would add a little caveat there. I think the leaders are there. They just haven't been, well, maybe to use a simple Bible word, they haven't been discipled. And when I discipled at a leadership level, and or as we commonly talk about, there's just not the right kind of leadership development's been done. Uh, I mean, I have to believe that if there's a mission that God meant for the church to accomplish, he's put everything he needs inside the church. And so my fundamental assumption is, yeah, the leadership's there. We just need ways to actually, how do we actually identify those gifts, equip those people to use those gifts, and then mobilize and send them out to use those gifts.
Yeah.
And with each of the practices that we actually have in the book, we talk about these 5 practices. We give a real simple tool with each of those practices. And the idea behind that is if someone's reading that and they're going like, okay, I don't want to be the church who doesn't have enough leaders. I want to be mobilizing and multiplying leaders. That like that afternoon, as they read it, they could begin to put that into practice. And that's part of our hope and dream.
Yeah. So you mentioned these 5 essential practices. Can you give us an overview of what those look like?
Sure. I mean, and you help me how long you want. We could go, 2 days on this thing.
Well, I tell you what, let's do it so people actually want to pick up the book and read it, Dave.
Okay.
So give us.
Don't give too much away. I know I'm not good at that. The first one is multiplication thinking. Multiplication thinking with these leaders, and maybe I should back up just a little bit. One of the things that we did is out of the think tank that we work with people, and we put all this list of practices on the board. So I think it was actually Dave Rhodes, or it may have been Todd Wilson. Somebody said, "You know what these people are?" And then they kind of answered their own question. They said, "These are people who aren't really trying to be the hero. They're not trying to like be in the spotlight all the time. That their real focus is trying to make heroes of other people." And then somebody said, well, then we coined the phrase hero maker. And that's the thing that's kind of the umbrella. But with that first practice is multiplication thinking. And I know for me, I remember being at a workshop with Neil Cole.
Mm-hmm.
And my dream at that point was I wanted to have a church of 1,000 people. If I could have a church of 1,000 people. And so he kind of called it out. He said, I want everybody to hear in this workshop, think about what your current dream is. So I was like, okay, 1,000 people. And then he said, now I want you to take your current dream and multiply it by 1 million. So I'll go 1,000 times 1 million, 1 billion. It took me a while to do the math, 1 billion. And then he said this, he said, so now I want you to ask yourself, how could you accomplish that dream? And what he did is he put into practice this practice of multiplication thinking. And it kind of was a little bit of it was a huge paradigm shift and kind of a mind melt, because all of a sudden, like 1,000, I thought I could probably pull that off myself. But all of a sudden 1 billion, you're going like, I can't do that myself. My church can't do it. My denomination can't do it. I'm going to have to train all kinds of leaders. I'm going to have to collaborate and work with all kinds of people. And it just kind of forced you to think outside yourself. And I think the first thing that happens with this multiplication thinking is all of a sudden you realize the best way for Tony to leverage his leadership is not just to do it through you, although God's made you an extraordinary leader. The best way for you to do is, how do I actually mobilize and multiply my leadership through helping other people and mobilizing them for ministry? So that's kind of the first one, multiplication thinking.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you know what? Can you? They're of the 5, Dave. And can you list the other 4 for us without
going into too much detail?
Yeah.
I got the hint. So second was permission giving. And we talk about having I, see, and you conversations. How do you give people permission to do those things? The third one, then we talk about it, and this is kind of the most important one, if you only had to pick one of them, and that is disciple multiplying. Mm-hmm. Disciple multiplying. And then the fourth one is what we call gift activating. So once they go through the process, they get to place. This is actually commissioning those people to fully activate their gifts. Mm-hmm. Okay, now you've gone through the process of being discipled as leader, go get them. And then the last one we call kingdom building. And in a phrase, kingdom building is this shift. Instead of counting the people who come to my thing, how do I begin to count? It's kind of a shift in the scoreboard, count the people I'm sending out to do God's thing. And that's a big change. So those are kind of overview of the 5.
Yeah. Of those 5, which one do you find to be the easiest for yourself, Dave?
Probably the permission giving, at least the kind of the tool that we use. We say I, C, and U, the 4 most important letters of the alphabet, I, C, and U. I don't know, maybe it's a gift. I don't know. I do find myself kind of just constantly, it sounds like I'm bragging a little bit, but I do find myself kind of, I'm encouraging people, and I kind of do have a tendency to kind of see like every person's possibility. So I think that one comes fairly easy for me.
I see that in you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Tony. I feel affirmed.
All right, so let me flip it then. Which of the 5 do you find the most challenging for you personally?
Probably the 3rd one, which is the most important, disciple multiplying. So, okay. I mean, even as a confession, so at a leadership, this is like discipleship at a leadership level. You've been around me enough to know, like, I'm forever, saying, hey, you need to have an apprentice leader. You need to be, thinking about this. So I'm working on this book. This is like, we'll say last fall to winter. And like, I was in a small group, but barely in a small group. I didn't really have an apprentice leader. And I know that, doing cool podcasts with Tony Morgan and all that, stuff like that can get in the way of me doing the stuff that I'm actually talking about. So I'm back on, I got an apprentice leader in my small group, Brent King. We meet on Mondays at 4:30 at Starbucks, and we're doing the stuff. But I know if I don't really stay after it, that'll be the first thing to go. Mm-hmm. And it takes the most work. That one takes the most work.
Yeah. All right. So you're describing, those 5 characteristics that you go into of what it really is to be a hero maker. Some of that sounds like, yeah, I can do that. And some of it, some of the folks that are watching, listening, may be wondering, I don't know, can I be a hero maker? And so I guess one of the key questions is, do you think anybody can be a hero maker, Dave?
Yeah. It's funny, the more I've gotten into this conversation, the more I realize the broader the application, and people even see stuff in it that I didn't see. 2 weeks ago, I spent some time with about 20 church leaders, and they're going to be teaching this to their whole church because they saw this as something that would apply to just the average person in their church, not at a leadership level, which was what I was thinking. Because they begin to talk about, like the I, C, and U conversations. What if we just begin to have those conversations with our kids? Mm-hmm. And we had this whole talk around, maybe our kids are the most important people and leaders we're going to develop. And disciple multiplying. And what if everybody said, no, I'm not just going to be a disciple, but to really be a disciple means that I'm multiplying myself. So yeah, I think anybody can, and I'll go and say I can and should do it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, God places us in all different places in life. We have different coworkers and family members and friends, and there's a level of influence that you're describing in this book that I think every one of us, there are lives that God put us around that we should have that type of influence, and we're encouraging people to take a next step. All right, so you started to allude to this in your last response, but as you know, Dave, it's primarily church leaders that are listening into these conversations, and so I want the pastors and church leaders that are listening to obviously grab a hold of your book and engage it personally. But how can pastors and church leaders take this resource and implement it with their teams? Any first steps that you would encourage church leaders to consider? Yeah,
in fact, all of chapter 12 is about how to create a hero-making culture. And kind of give a few hints at that. And we give it, again, try to make it really accessible. It's not that it's easy, but it's easy to understand. And we give them 7 steps to create a hero-making culture. And the first one is do it. I think sometimes in all the minutiae of all the stuff we do, we forget as leaders that what we primarily are, our primary thing is we're culture creators. We are culture creators, and you're going to reproduce who you are. And so if you want other people in your church, if you want your parents to be hero makers, you want people to be hero makers, making the most of everybody around them in the workplace. If you want your staff team to be investing in leaders and multiplying leaders, I mean, as a senior level leader, if you're a pastor listening, you need to be the one that does it first. You will reproduce who you are. One guy put it this way. He said this, he said, you will get the culture you deserve. And so I think that's one of the things I'm most excited about. Well, I guess I'm excited about two things. One is the average leader taking this and beginning to use the practice. But the second thing is like senior level leadership going like, okay, how do we create a culture? Because culture is something that works 24/7.
Right.
You know, culture just never stops. Vision casting you do once a month or once a year, but culture is something that constantly is reinforcing those values. And that's why I'm excited about that part of it.
Well, Dave, I really appreciate the work you've put into this. I don't know how you turn out great books so frequently. You're going to have to share your secret at some point, but this one's a great book, and I think it's going to be a huge benefit to leaders individually, but more importantly for the cause that I think both you and I are about, for the overall health and impact of the churches that we're trying to serve as well. So thanks for joining us for today's conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tony, very much.